Dr. Kellie Carter-Jackson is a Harvard College Fellow in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her research focuses on Black abolitionists and violent political discourse. Dr. Carter-Jackson earned her PhD in history from Columbia University as a Richard Hofstadter Faculty Fellow, working closely with advisor and historian Eric Foner. She has presented research at numerous national and international conferences held at the University of Cambridge, the Ubuntu Crawl in Johannesburg, South Africa, Yale University, Boston University, the American Historical Association, and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Arts Uncut had the pleasure of catching up with Dr. Carter-Jackson during her lecture at the Cambridge Public Library as she took a look behind some of the films that garnered Oscar attention and awards.
I remember when Malcolm X came out, this film was transformative for me. How many people saw the film? Phenomenal. And I remember saying to my dad, I remember crying at the end because I was probably, I won't tell you how old, but I was young when I saw it. I remember crying at the end of the film because I didn't really know the history, but I knew that Malcolm X existed. I was sad that he was assassinated. I had all of these emotions at the end of the film. And then I said to my dad, oh my gosh, Denzel Washington, he did such a good job. He looks just like Malcolm X. And my dad said, no, he doesn't. And I said, yes, he does. And then when I saw, again, an actual picture of a very fair-skinned Malcolm X with bright red hair, they really don't bear that much resemblance. But it's the fact that the way Denzel plays Malcolm X is so powerful that you believe that they are one and the same. And that is what film does. Film is intensely powerful. It makes you believe, it makes you distrust, it makes you cry, it gives you nightmares, it gives you heart palpitations, it can give you inexplicable joy. That is the power of film. What I want to talk about is the single story of Lincoln and Django. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Chimamanda Adichie. She is one of my favorite authors. I use her all the time. And she has this great TED Talk where she talks about the danger of the single story. The single story is a story that gets told over and over and over again, and it has a lot of power attached to it. The single story is one line: Lincoln freed the slaves, right? You hear that story over and over again, and that is what the 13th Amendment becomes. That is what the Civil War becomes. That is what this film really becomes about. And the same thing for Django. Django is a representation of a lot of other single stories that we've seen play out in film, play out in TV, and in media. So I want to break this talk up into 5 points. And so these points that I talk about: first, how film is a tool. Second, to talk about this theme of commodities and characters. Third, to talk about the difference between choosing versus creating choice. 4, to talk about you are what you eat. And it doesn't sound like it'll make a lot of sense, but it will when I get to it. And then lastly, and the Oscar goes to, which will give us a little bit of time to talk about this award season. So firstly, film is a tool. So I tell a lot of my students when I use film in class, because I use film all the time in class, that film on its own is pretty benign. It's just a tool. It's neither good or bad. It's like a hammer. A hammer is really only a hammer when we give it purpose. When we take a hammer to build a house, we can do something very constructive with that tool. When we take a hammer to deconstruct a house, we can do something very damaging with that tool. It is all in the purpose behind how the tool is used. And the same thing is really happening with film. Each director has a tool in their hand, typically called a camera, but he also has other props, actors, things of that nature, set scenes, that give you a particular image, that serve a particular purpose. So when we're talking about Lincoln, Spielberg has a certain tool, a certain hammer that he uses to shape this story of Abraham Lincoln and the 13th Amendment. And when I looked at the cast of characters who were playing in Lincoln, they're all white. They're all white. The story of abolitionism and emancipation is noticeably absent of African Americans within this film. And I don't know how many of you have seen the film, either film, so spoiler alert, because I'll definitely be sharing some things tonight that will inform some of the things that you maybe already saw, or persuade you on some of the things that you might see if you choose to see the film. It's interesting when we talk about this, though, because when we look at the actual history of emancipation, during the Civil War, over 400,000 African American men and women are fleeing the South in droves. Thousands of people are leaving daily. The story of the slaves freeing themselves is really the story of American history. The story of over 250,000 African American soldiers who fight in the Civil War, who turned the tide of the Civil War, are really responsible in a lot of ways for the major successes of the Civil War, don't get focused on within this particular film. So the tool that Spielberg is using and employing is he's painting this picture, and in painting this picture, the history of the 13th Amendment of Emancipation gets literally whitewashed, no pun intended. There's a great historian, Kate Mazur, who gives this critique in the New York Times in talking about Lincoln, and she says, "It's disappointing that a movie devoted to explaining the abolition of slavery in the United States, African Americans do almost nothing but passively wait for white men to liberate them. For some 30 years, historians have been demonstrating that slaves were crucial agents in their own emancipation. Yet Mr. Spielberg's Lincoln gives us only faithful servants patiently waiting for the day of Jubilee." And there's a lot you can unpack in that particular quote. So I will, and I'll tie it into the danger of the single story. The danger of the single story, and these two first lines are actually quotes straight from Chimamanda Adichie's The Danger of the Single Story. She says, "So that is how you create a single story. You show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become." She says, power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the only story of that person. So film becomes a really powerful tool when you realize that in 2.5 hours with the film of Lincoln, we can essentially undo 30 years of historical scholarship that somehow ignores the presence and participation of African Americans. And not just ignores them, but almost makes them irrelevant to the entire story that's taking place. And what this does, this robs people of their agency. This robs people of their contributions that they've made to history. It makes it difficult to teach about the story of liberty and freedom without showing you a white presence that enables those things to happen, particularly for children of color. And not just children of color, but white children as well, because when we put forth this single story, it not only disadvantages students of color, but also advantages white students who can stake claim in a false sense of superiority about the contributions that they have contributed to the society as well. When I first saw the trailer for Lincoln, I was so excited to see it. One, because the music was so powerful and it gets you really excited. And if you see the trailer, Google it. The first maybe 10 to 30 seconds of the trailer also you black images, right? They show you black men fighting anymore, these clippets of the black soldiers, these clippets of Elizabeth Cleckley. So you start to believe that the film is more about African Americans than it really leads on to believe. And then maybe the last minute and a half is more about Lincoln fighting for this 13th Amendment. But it's really interesting to see, again, the tools being used to show you a portrait of Lincoln. So moving on from Lincoln, we'll talk about Tarantino's tool, or Tarantino's hammer. And I actually found this great picture of Leonardo DiCaprio with the hammer, which is pretty interesting. So what Tarantino is doing is taking his hammer to, instead of construct an image of something, he's using it to really deconstruct, to destroy, to blow up, to shoot him up, bang him up, every single possible notion of slavery and all of its neatness. And what Tarantino does is he takes the film Birth of a Nation, which is a classic film, comes out in 1915, D.W. Griffith, and he flips that on his head. So instead of having a film in which you have the white damsel in distress, and you have the Klan who becomes heroes, and the Klan becomes, the hero that the white South needs to restore itself, the same thing is happening with Django. In this film, though, the Klan is really a group of buffoons, and they are unintelligent and unorganized. And in this case, Django is the hero who's going after his damsel in distress. But there's a lot of things. I could talk about Django all day long. I could do a whole talk on Django. Django has so many things to really deconstruct in this film. And there's a lot of things I think that Tarantino is doing that is very good, but there are a lot of things that Tarantino is doing that is really problematic with these images. And when I watched the film, and this is a film that I've actually watched several times, I noticed that every time there was images of slaves or slavery, it was always in the distance, out of focus, not really with African Americans saying very much, very few lines, if any at all, aside from Django. Even Kerry Washington herself, who plays Broomhilda, has probably one page of script. And I realized that this is not a story about slavery. This is about a story with slavery as the backdrop. And that there's a lot of scenes in the film where Tarantino is zoning in on something particular he wants you to see, an object or someone's hands, or something that is very inanimate, that you'll see him spend a couple seconds on that particular frame. And then whenever it's large groups of African Americans, the flame is very, very quick. You don't see black images in groups up for very long. And I started looking at frame after frame, noticing, why is it that everyone is in the distance? Why is it that everyone is out of focus? And what I realized that what Tarantino is doing as well is leading into my second point, which is he's creating these commodities and these characters with his black actors and the roles that they play. This hypersexualization of the black body is not just on the screen, it's not just in film, but it's also in print. So I'm sure some of you have seen this image before, and when I saw this film, I was photograph, I was livid, I was incensed. And I want to tell you something especially. I blocked out the images of the woman's private parts, and I didn't do that because I wanted to make this a PG audience. I didn't do this because I'm trying to censor or keep you from seeing something that you probably have already seen. I did this because black women's bodies in particular have been so exploited and so hypersexualized that in seeing this image, I felt like I would be perpetuating that same thing over and over again. It's really interesting. I've been able to be a part of this reading group called The Dark Room. Shout out to The Dark Room. And we talk about the visual image a lot and how the image is portrayed and the power of the image. And we started talking about how black women's bodies are always on display, and how National Geographic is like notorious for this. You always see the African woman, she's naked, she's got on nothing but beads, she's got her breasts hanging out, she's feeding her baby, she's, doing all of these things. She becomes so exotic. And I realized, we don't do that with white women. We don't show white women, half naked, breastfeeding their babies. They're not these exotic characters where we have them in National Geographic and we're taking all of these pictures of them in some faraway land. But we do that with black women over and over again. And when I saw this image, I was angered by the fact that so many people had said that Tarantino was an ally to African Americans, and that Tarantino was making great films for African Americans, and that he was giving them jobs, and that what he was contributing was so significant. But again, there is a purpose to every single thing that he's doing, and there's power behind every single image that we see up on the screen. And if we're not careful, we can let these images fly by and never really deconstruct them. And so in my classrooms, I'm always trying to get students to deconstruct these images, to deconstruct what they're seeing. Don't just sit in the chair and eat popcorn and check out, but really think about what is the purpose that this director is trying to achieve within their film. When talking about Django, we get a lot of these caricatures that are not real. A lot of these people that I call, Disney presents slavery. And that you see the Mammy and the Zip Coon, and especially Stephen within the film, the Uncle Tom, the Sambo. And I have to tell students over and over again that these are not representative of real people. That these are not representative of the men and the women and the mothers and the daughters and the sisters and the brothers that bared the hard, brutal labor of slavery. But we get so caught up on these manifestations of idyllic characters of slavery. The character of Stephen is no more real than a leprechaun, right? But in the film, it's interesting how he becomes really the epicenter of all of our hate and disdain. Even when I watched the film, I hated the character of Candy, but when I saw Stephen, I was enraged. And then when I left the film, I had to check myself because I said, how is it that I'm more upset about a slave than I am about the slave owner? That I'm more angry or see the major villain within this story as the slave instead of the slave owner or the institution of slavery itself. I think Stephen becomes this character in which audiences can channel their animosity, can channel their disdain, and they can say either A, I'm not as bad as that, or C, you people do it to yourselves, right? This doesn't have anything to do with me. Your problems are all your own problems. That's what that image of the Mammy and the Zip Coon and the Uncle Tom portray over and over again. But what I have to tell students is that these people are not real, and there's an agenda behind perpetuating these characters, perpetuating these commodities. When I was a little kid, my mom would allow me to pick out what I wanted to wear, kind of. She would say to me, do you want to wear the red dress or do you want to wear the purple dress? And I would say, the purple dress. And I would feel so empowered in being able to pick out, this is what I chose, what I'm going to wear today. And then it wasn't until I got older and I realized that I was choosing, but my mom was creating the choice. My mom had the keys to the wardrobe, right? My mom was basically the one who was putting the options before me and saying, you can wear this or you can wear that. That is really what the whole film industry is about. It is about choosing. It's not really about creating choice. What the film industry does is they basically say, you want to watch a black film? You want Tyler Perry? You want Spike Lee? That's what they do. Oh, you want to watch something by a black woman? We got Shonda Rhimes. Those are your options. Those are your options. This is the single story perpetuated over and over again. And the problem is that when we look at other directors, particularly white directors, there's so much more choice involved. There's a diversity of options and stories and people who are giving characters and romantic comedies and dramas and thrillers that aren't just limited to these three people. And when I look at choice, choosing and creating choice, I look at, what Tarantino is doing and what Steven Spielberg is doing, and I find that in a lot of ways, we empower them to choose for us. We empower them to choose our clothes, to choose our characters, to choose our context, to choose our language, to choose our outcome. these are really, really important things to talk about, because we think that we have so much agency when we go to the theater. I've got $10 in my hand or $12 in my hand, and this is the film that I'm choosing to watch. But you are choosing to watch a set of films that have been pre-selected for you to preview. So these are not necessarily choices that we are able to make all on our own. When Django came out, they were doing interviews of all the cast. And they talked to Samuel Jackson. And they basically said, are you worried about this film being controversial? Are you worried about the character that you're playing and what people might say? And he said, when it comes down to what people want, they want to watch something that they can eat popcorn with. They want to be entertained. They want to have something that gives them 2.5 hours. They get their Diet Coke, their hot dog, their good and plenty, and they're good to go. And I found this to be intensely problematic. He said, if you wanted to learn history, then watch a documentary, right? And that's kind of what we do to PBS and a lot of these shows that I watch all the time, public television, where people are like, that's PBS's thing. They'll put out a documentary, but that's not the responsibility or the role. That's journalism. That's not what we have to do. Film is art. In a lot of ways, it is art, but I started thinking about how this whole industry trivializes, particularly films that happen to do with history or happen to deal with history. And that when I'm watching a romantic comedy or the newest Die Hard, I don't mind eating popcorn with that. I don't mind checking out a little bit for a couple hours. But I'm watching something like the Holocaust, or something on domestic workers, or something on the Tuskegee Airmen, or even something on slavery. I don't want that with popcorn, right? I don't want that with a Snickers and some M&Ms, because these are real histories, and these are representative of real people, one of which was my grandmother, right? My grandmother worked as a domestic worker for over 60 years, and it was difficult for me to watch The Help, because there's truth in it, but then there's also a purpose behind it that doesn't really get deconstructed. And I started to realize that we can't trivialize these films, these historical films, that we have to come to the table with a certain level of respect, a certain level of scholarship, a certain level of due diligence to really do these things well. But if you were to ask Samuel Jackson, he would say, hey, that's not our business, that's not our entertainment. And I realized that in asking films to be entertaining and educational, that it's like asking McDonald's to have, grass-fed cows, hormone-free, and all of these things. It's not going to happen. So you're not going to see these things happen at McDonald's. And for some of those reasons, it's the same, because it can't be mass produced, right? Because, people won't buy it. It's going to cost too much. We make up the same excuses for fast food as we do for film. But the interesting thing is that both film and fast food, we're both consuming them. And when it becomes this processed, type of story that lacks an organic feel to it, that doesn't have authentic characters, that doesn't have multidimensional characters, that doesn't have layered histories within it. It's where all you're seeing is the single story over and over again. You start to become what you're consuming, and you start to regurgitate what you're consuming. And this food metaphor sounds crazy, but I'll give you an example. I've had multiple students, who watch Django and will say to me, man, it's real messed up that there were Mandingo fighters in slavery. And I was like, what? There are no Mandingo fighters in slavery. That's in a film. That's not real. But the idea is that you consume it, it goes in, it comes out. You see it on the film, you believe it to be true. The same thing goes for the film Glory. I love the film Glory. But at the end of the film, they have everyone die. That's not true. So students will say to me, man, it's a shame that there are black soldiers and they all die at the end of the movie. Yes, at the end of the movie, but not in the history, right? Not in the history. Not all black soldiers are being, killed off in large numbers like they are in the film Glory, where there's no one left to really tell the tale. So I wanted to kind of talk about these things because I think it's interesting to compare the two metaphors, because in the food industry, lately there's been a turn, right? You see how more people are wanting to buy local, wanting to buy organic, wanting to really think about what's going into their food. The documentary Food Inc. has come out, Fast Food Nation, all of these things. We're so into what we put into our bodies. I remember having a friend over and I said, oh, do you want a bagel? No, I'm gluten-free. Like, there's all these things we become so conscious about what we put in our bodies. But we don't use that same due diligence with what we put in our minds, right? With what we put into our intellectual being. We have to do the same amount of diligence for what we consume, food-wise, but also with what we're consuming visually, because those things stay with us. Just like Malcolm X stood with me as a little kid, those images have profound impacts on how we see and understand this world. So the last point I really want to talk about is in the Oscar goes to. And the Oscar goes to, apparently, Daniel Day-Lewis, Christopher Waltz, and Quentin Tarantino. And I was excited to watch the Oscars, but when I saw who is winning, I thought, this is telling. We have Daniel Day-Lewis, who wins Best Actor for Lincoln. We have Christopher Waltz, who wins Best Supporting Actor for Django. And then Quentin Tarantino wins for Best Original Screenplay. And I started to think about this film, and I started to say, when we look at how we value things, how we honor things, we do that with awards. And what this award ceremony looked like to me was a celebration of the white liberal, a celebration of look at what we have done for history, which is intensely political when we start to think of the fact that, wow, this is the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and this is the 100th anniversary of the March on Washington. And these films that are coming out in intensely political times, but who we're honoring, who becomes the face of the franchise, is often the white male. And what it does is it allows people to tell our own stories, but not just tell our stories, but have validation in telling those stories, be rewarded for telling those stories. And that's not to say that I wish Jamie Foxx had been nominated or Kerry Washington, because I didn't think that they particularly did great jobs. But it does go to show you the scripts that they're being given versus the script that Christopher Waltz is getting, the time that you see them on screen versus the time that you see Christopher Waltz, the character development that you have with Christopher Waltz versus the character development that you have with Django. It's all very political, and it's the same thing with Daniel Day-Lewis. And that's not to knock their acting skills one bit, because these are all phenomenal actors. But we do have to question, why is it that we praise them in the way that they do? What is it about the scripts and the scenes and the particular roles that they're getting that make us want to glorify them maybe a little bit more than we should? So I also want to talk about, in Hollywood and in history, what racism is and what racism isn't. And one of my major contingencies with the film is that, and this goes for Lincoln and Django, but mostly Django, is that racism is not just the Klan and the N-word. I think we get very caught up on the Klan or the image of the Klan, and especially the N-word. I mean, it's used well over 100 times in this film. But that is not just racism. That is not what's just problematic. That racism is so much more complex than that. That racism is not just this simple binary of good and evil. And we see this play out in a lot of films, particularly The Help is a perfect example of that. When you see racism play out in The Help, the villain is always mean and bad, but the hero is always kind-hearted and good. And it allows you to believe that whites fall into those categories, that you're either a racist because you're a part of the Klan, or because you're hilly, right, on The Help, or you're a good white liberal who is good-natured and thinks that everyone is fantastic and deserves a chance, right? People don't always act in those ways. And a lot of times the way racism plays out is in very kind ways. Sometimes when we look at systemic racism and what happens with racism, the kindest people, the people that smile in your face, are the ones that are perpetuating and doing the most damage within the system. Racism is also about advantages of whiteness. And so when I look at the Django cover, that binary of good and evil is also there, where you have Django, if I could go back a little bit, to where this one is. I think it's really telling how you have Django in the center, and then it's like you have the villain on the left, and then like the good conscious on the right. Even the way that the billing is set up, it's good and evil, and then there's Django, right? And he kind of falls in between these two characters. That is the binary that I'm talking about that happens a lot. But this binary is problematic because it basically allows whites to not just be oppressors, but to also be moral authorities. So how is it that you can have a film where we're both bad and good at the same time? And black characters somehow have to navigate their oppression and their moral superiority all at the same time. The second thing I thought is that racism is about hegemony. It's about participating in your own oppression in a lot of ways. And you can ask, well, how does that happen? How do you participate in your own oppression? But it happens often without our knowing, often consciously and unconsciously. We do this by accepting things in films, by dismissing things in film, by saying, it's just entertainment. It's just good fun. It's not a big deal. Stop making it too deep. And by doing that, we stop or halt or arrest a productive conversation that could happen, but that doesn't happen. That always somehow gets stopped. So I want to talk about this because I think it's important when we look at film. We validate films with our dollars. Every time we go to the box office, we validate a film, whether we liked it or not. And we canonize films by the marketing that takes place and the merchandising that takes place and all of the hoopla around it. And then we honor films with awards that come after this. So these films get solidified in our memory forever. A perfect example of this is Titanic, right? So we know that Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet weren't really on the Titanic, that their stories are complete fiction. But for some reason, we cannot separate the story and the history of the Titanic with this particular image, right? The two most famous lines are, I'm king of the world, right? And I'll never let go, Jack. Like, you hear those things over and over again, and that is what the story of the Titanic becomes. And it's so interesting how there's so many different people on the Titanic. There's thousands of people. There's so many stories to be told, particularly like the story of the LaRoche family, who's the only black family on the Titanic. And it's a powerful story because it's a Haitian husband, and he goes to France and he meets his French wife, and they have 2 children, and they decide to make a better life for themselves, and they're going to get on the Titanic and they're going to start fresh again. And the story is so tragic because the husband says, when the ship's going down, that he's going to save his wife and his children, and he makes sure they that they get on a lifeboat, and he goes down with the ship, and it's so tragic. But that's the story that we don't tell, right? That's the story that nobody knows, and that's actually another story. I'm getting off topic. So, but I meant to show you that this is important, that we have to have these conversations, that when we just have the single story of I'll never let go, Jack, we completely forget that there are other people on the boat, right? There are other people on the ship. So, the danger of the single story. In truth, we love the single story. We love the single story. We love Die Hard 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? We love Rocky 1 through 5. We love the James Bond series, right? These are all the same films over and over and over again. But we like seeing them. We like Harry Potter 1 through 7, which is insane, right? Actually, 1 through 8, if you see it the way the films play out. We love the single story. But a good film is not so much about the politics of respectability. It's not just making a film in which everyone has their best interest put forward. But making a good film is really about combating the single story, combating the single story, showing other narratives that you don't typically see, giving stories and giving histories that aren't popular, that aren't constantly within the paper mill. The single story does something that is intensely problematic. It takes things that should really be at the center and pushes them to the periphery. And then it takes things that are at the periphery and pushes them to the center. And oftentimes it does that at the expense of women, at the expense of people of color, at the expense of African Americans. That is what the danger of the single story does over and over again. And so I quote historian Jacob Burthard all the time because this quote really, really sticks with me, where he says, "Beware the terrible simplifiers. Beware of the terrible simplifiers." That is what we do when we say, film, it's just a movie. It's just entertainment, right? It's just something that you watch and you can check out for a few hours. It doesn't mean anything. It has no real significance to it. And we have to be careful when we simplify something like that, because when we simplify it down to that, we dismiss a lot. We push a lot to the periphery. And I would like to think that surely all of us want a happy ending, some Coke and some popcorn, right? But I would hope that when we see historical films, that we would want a little bit more than that. Thank you.